Welcome back. You're watching A Closer Look. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Aravana Apia. And joining me in studio now is the Member of Parliament for the Fox Hill constituency, Minister Fred Mitchell.
Good.
Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, nice to be here.
Okay, so Minister, we've been talking a lot about emancipation, the lead up to that historic event, what was happening at that time. In your estimation, why should Emancipation Day be something that Bahamians should be concerned about and want to celebrate?
Well, the population of the Bahamas is mainly African-based descent, and for much of our history, there's been legal discrimination and then social discrimination against people of African descent. And that marker, the 1st of August 1834, is one of the historic markers where the assertion, the affirmation of the humanity of African people was affirmed in the Bahamas, or the Bahama Islands as it then was. So in order to reaffirm our humanity, to remember where we came from, it's very important to have that context about where we are. And you know, we still have these problems of self-esteem. Dark skin is still almost a curse in this country. You know, people trying to bleach their skin and all of those kinds of things. So there needs to be a push all the time for this reaffirmation of those of African descent. And then, of course, the question of the larger issues of freedom are important, that each person has human dignity and should be free to exercise their life the way they want to as a free people.
You spoke about the reaffirmation of people of African descent. What other elements do you think were really brought to the forefront with the abolition of slavery, the Abolition Act of 1834, and then the full emancipation of liberated Africans at that time?
Well, you know, we're still struggling with the legacy of that act, because the act, while it abolished slavery and so-called freed the slaves, the only persons who got compensated for it were the owners of the slaves. And I think it's just in recent times that the British government finished paying off the loans from that period. So the British government borrowed money, translated into today's money, it's billions of dollars, which they paid the slave owners for the slaves. The slaves and their descendants never got any compensation for the free labor. And these societies were built, not only the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, but throughout the Caribbean. This was the richest source of capital, the Caribbean region, for the United Kingdom.
Right.
And there's been no compensation. So the question today still is, how do we compensate the descendants of the slaves for that discrimination?
Right.
And that's why the issue of reparations is being discussed so loudly today.
Okay, let's talk about reparations, because I think when people hear the term reparations, they think only money. Let's talk about what that could look like for descendants of Africans living in the Bahamas and elsewhere in the region.
Well, it could mean money, but it also means restorative justice in one sense. Let's say what happened at Georgetown University is one such example, where, and Cambridge University, where their endowments were actually supported by slave labor and the investment in slaves. So what has happened is those universities are now offering bursaries and scholarships to the descendants of African people so they can access the university. That's one example of it. There are a couple of court cases which are now working their way through the systems in the CARICOM region, and may even emerge into the United States to deal with these issues. But you see it in the social discrimination which exists in many of these countries, and there needs to be a whole job in public education about the value of human beings so that it never happens again.
I think something that you noted about access to education, that has been something that's sort of been at the forefront of a lot of the conversations surrounding reparations, because education is one way that people are able to lift themselves out of poverty, out of you know, their current situations. Do you think that there's enough focus being put on that locally?
The reparations issue has gotten caught up in some difficult arguments here, because the society here tends to say, oh, that happened a long time ago. Why are we concerned about it? But if you look at the continuum of our history and trace it right back, you'll see that even after slavery was legally abolished, there was in fact social discrimination, and that social discrimination still exists today. Even though we are supposedly free, it still exists today. And it exists in little ways like this. You walk into a bank and you want to get a loan, and you're a certain skin color, and you go there and they look at you a certain way. Someone else of a different hue goes into the bank and gets a walkthrough. That kind of discrimination exists across the world, not just the Bahamas.
Right.
And until this kind of internal discrimination, until that we are able to strike that down, we must continue to discuss and talk about this issue.
Let's go back to the abolition of slavery. I know there were so many people who were fighting for the emancipation of black and brown people. Can you talk about, as far as Bahamians are concerned, who are some of the people that we should look to and celebrate as leading the call for emancipation?
Well, I think the person who most comes to mind is the slave Pompey, who led a revolt, was a slave in Exuma, in Steventon. There is a monument which is built to his memory in Exuma today. And he was going to be, with his mates, transferred summarily to a plantation in San Salvador. Okay. Didn't want to go. And so they left, led a revolt, came to Nassau. They were punished for it, and punished severely, but goes down in history as one of the revolts against the chattel slavery of Africans in this country. And there is a telling of history in the Bahamas that tries to portray this as some kind of benign system. But the dehumanizing effects of it are throughout our history. For people like Black Dick, poor Black Kate, all are throughout our history examples of how there's systematic discrimination against people of African descent. And if people want to read an authoritative work on this, read Sean McQueenie's Breaching the Gates, which was published perhaps 2 years ago, which tells of what happened after slavery was abolished and the efforts to prevent people of color from getting into the House of Assembly. He tells the story of after the Haitian Revolution, for example, people the power structure in this country were frightened that the revolution was going to spread here. So there were laws passed banning gatherings in the streets of more than a few people, and they changed the laws to define whether you were black or white. And some people went to bed one night, they were white, and the next morning they found out they were black because they had so-called 1 ounce of black blood in them. So these things existed in the Bahamas, and that legacy is what we're still fighting today.
You spoke about Sean McQueenie's writings on this subject. Do you think, in speaking to Dr. Feller about slavery and the history, she mentioned something that I took note of, which is that the Bahamas is not really mentioned prominently in the regional histories, the regional accounts. And she suggested that, maybe there needs to be a revamping of that to really highlight the role that the Bahamas played, not just as a transit, but sort of in the abolition and the eventual, ending of slavery. Do you agree?
Well, one of the things I want to tell is the story is always told, former Prime Minister Perry Christie used to always say, the tale of the hunt is always told by the hunter. And the problem is that's the way history is written. Yeah. The fact is that slaves revolted against slavery, and it was the slaves themselves that brought about freedom, not the benign work of people or the work of people in these developed countries who took advantage. Yes, they had the legal responsibility, but slavery was something which the slaves continuously revolted against and brought about their freedom. And as regards this country and the stories, Dr. D. Gale Saunders, who was our first archivist, and was just honored with an Order of the Bahamas, has written half a dozen, if not more, books about the history of slavery in this country, the abolition, and the systematic discrimination in our politics. Another seminal work is Colin Hughes's book, Race and Politics in the Bahamas. Very important. So the story is told by some people.
Mm-hmm. We've talked a lot about what the abolition of slavery accomplished, what the emancipation of African descendants accomplished. In what way do you think the Emancipation Proclamation is still unfinished business for descendants of Africans?
Well, you know, we have this social job to do. As I said, the social discrimination still exists. I was told a story by a teacher who is light-skinned down in one of our islands, and he was trying to encourage his students who were dark-skinned that this was not something which they should be preoccupied. And he said after the class was over, one of the students came up to him and said, "Now, you know, Mr. So-and-so, you know you like being light-skinned, hey?" So that stuff is still ingrained in people. The other day I was shocked to hear one of the 21-year-olds that sort of hang around me say that so-and-so has good hair. So these expressions are still culturally ingrained in the Bahamas. And so we have that battle to continue to fight. Mm-hmm. And the battle for economic empowerment is also caught up in the classism and racism of the history of the Bahamas, which we constantly have to fight. And it is a very uncomfortable subject to talk about race, very, very uncomfortable, but it's a discussion which must be had.
Mm-hmm. In terms of that economic empowerment, you know, a lot of slave owners became extremely wealthy off the backs of the enslaved, and like you said earlier, that has never sort of balanced itself out. In your estimation, how do we actually make inroads to address that imbalance?
Well, the government has a role to play, and this is why all of these transfer payments, and in the United States it's called affirmative action, which is to try and go backwards and compensate for the discrimination and losses which existed in the past. That is something which we have to look at here in the Bahamas. We have majority rule here. The government has been seeking to find ways to broaden the economic base, to increase the pie by using a combination of transfer payments, special loans for people so that they can get a jump up and broaden the economic base. So from a combination of all of those things, you know, I was very interested in some discussions that Sir Hilary Beckles, who is the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies and a good friend, and he was responding to the criticism which these developed societies have about our societies and the level of debt which we've taken on. And he was reminding us that when Jamaica became independent in 1962, I think the literacy rate may have been less than 10%. So the government, when they came in and were so-called handed this state by the British, they had to do a lot of work to try and bring the population up, and that required borrowing money. So there's no surprise that these societies are in debt, just as we are in debt now as a result. What, 50% of our debt, national debt, is due to climate issues, which are not of our making. So there's a lot of unfairness in this, and this is why public education is so important, because there's a tendency for the slaves and their descendants to be blamed for their condition, and that we have to debunk.
As we prepare to celebrate and observe Emancipation Day, what is your hope for the country as we pause to sort of reflect and you know, chart a way forward? What is your hope?
Well, first, in a social sense, I hope everybody has a good time and, you know, come up to Foxhill for Emancipation Day. And the second Tuesday in August is Foxhill Day. And watch the climbing of the Greasy Pole, participate in the Junkanoo. And I hope that that the 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds can have fun and not fight. I mean, there's no reason for it. Just enjoy yourselves. There's no reason for it. So I hope that is. But behind it all, I hope that there is a sense, a reaffirmation of our heritage, of our humanity, and that there is a discussion again about where we are on these issues and how far we have to go. The poet says we have miles to go before we sleep. Miles to go.
Well, that's all the time we have with the minister tonight. Thank you so much for being here, Minister.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
We have more of a closer look after the break. Stay with us.